A veteran police officer, notorious for his harsh demeanor and deeply ingrained racial prejudices, set his sights on a suspicious individual at the airport. A tall black man, dressed impeccably in a tailored suit, carrying a passport from the Republic of West Africa. With an air of confidence, the man approached security, but instead of performing his duty, the officer allowed his bias to take control. Not only did he refuse to examine the man's documents, but he brazenly burned the passport right in front of a crowd of onlookers, accompanied by a disdainful challenge. What the officer didn't realize was that the man standing before him was none other than his new boss. When the truth came to light, the officer was left utterly shocked. What began as a personal confrontation at the airport unraveled into a deeper narrative of systemic injustice, one rooted in prejudice and the abuse of power. Does the man have the strength to reform a system so deeply corrupted, or will he be crushed by the very biases he seeks to dismantle? Join us as we explore this gripping and inspiring journey. But before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. And don't forget to hit the subscribe button to ensure you don't miss other meaningful stories like this one. Inside the international airport, passengers' flow toward security checkpoints seemed unending. The loudspeaker announcements of departing flights, the hurried voices of travelers calling to each other, and the cries of children created a cacophony that filled the air. On many faces, exhaustion was evident after long hours of waiting. Checkpoint number 7 was a place most passengers avoided if they could. This was the domain of Officer Jack Whitman, a veteran cop with over 25 years of experience. Jack was notorious for his harsh demeanor and his lack of patience with passengers. Towering and broad-shouldered, with graying hair and a face etched by years of service, Jack's reputation didn't stem from his appearance but from his unapologetically judgmental and abrasive attitude. He often made snap judgments about passengers, deciding in an instant who seemed suspicious. Unfortunately, those who didn't share his outward characteristics were often the first to feel the sting of his scrutiny. Jack's chair creaked as he leaned back, his bored eyes lazily skimming over passports as if the task were the dullest thing in the world. The queue ahead of him stretched endlessly. He flipped through a passport handed to him by a passenger, then returned it with a dismissive smirk. Another traveler was detained for further scrutiny, adding to the ever-growing line. When a tall black man approached the counter, time seemed to momentarily freeze. David Carter walked up with an air of rare confidence. Wearing a sleek black tailored suit with a dark blue tie as an accent, and carrying a small, neat briefcase, he exuded calm authority. A faint smile played on his lips, contrasting sharply with the tense atmosphere around him. He placed his passport on the counter, meeting Jack's gaze without hesitation or fear. Jack glanced at David and picked up the passport. His expression turned sour as he read the cover. West African Republic. He let out a derisive laugh, looking up to meet David's eyes with a condescending glare. This passport isn't worth anything here. It's just a worthless piece of paper, Jack sneered. David remained composed. In a steady, measured tone, he replied, "This is an internationally recognized document. You have no right to treat me this way." A murmur rippled through the nearby passengers. A few people frowned, taking note of the exchange. But Jack, unfazed, shrugged dismissively. He sighed dramatically, as if dealing with a tiresome chore. Then, to the astonishment of everyone present, Jack reached into his pocket and retrieved a small silver lighter. Flicking it open, he held the flame to the corner of the passport and watched as the document began to burn. The entire scene unfolded in seconds, but for those watching, time seemed to stretch. The flames consumed the paper, reducing it to ash that drifted onto the counter. The atmosphere grew stiflingly heavy. Some passengers stared with their mouths agape, while others scrambled to record the incident on their phones. Jack wore a triumphant grin, locking eyes with David in open defiance. "Go ahead. Try to file a complaint if you can," he said mockingly. David didn't respond for a few moments. He bent down to pick up the charred remains of the passport, brushing the burnt fragments off the counter. Straightening up, he fixed Jack with a calm yet piercing stare. His voice was steady and razor-sharp. "You'll regret this." Without another word, David turned and walked away, his posture tall and unshaken, as if Jack's actions had failed to rattle him in the slightest. His suit jacket swayed slightly with his stride, leaving behind a profound silence that hung over the checkpoint. Jack shrugged and returned to his post, pretending to be unaffected. What he didn't realize was that this act would set in motion a series of events that would not only upend his life, but also tarnish the reputation of the police force he served. After his shift at the airport, Jack Whitman drove home, the image of the man in the tailored suit with the unyielding stare lingering in his mind. However, Jack dismissed his unease with a shrug, telling himself he had merely done his job. Jack's car pulled up in front of his two-story suburban home, the golden glow of lights spilling warmly from the windows as if to welcome him. But Jack had no idea that the story he was about to recount inside would shatter the peaceful atmosphere. Linda Whitman, his wife, was busy preparing dinner in the kitchen. Their daughter, Emily, a university student, sat at the dining table with her laptop open. Jack strode into the house, a self-satisfied look plastered across his face, and flopped onto the living room sofa. "Today, at the airport was a real mess," Jack began, his tone brimming with pride. "There was this cocky black guy, dressed like some big shot, flashing a passport that was pure junk. I taught him a lesson." Linda stopped chopping vegetables, turning to him with a puzzled look. "What do you mean, Jack? What did you do?" Jack laughed heartily, his smugness on full display. "He handed me a passport from some African country, probably worthless paper. I burned it right in front of him. You should have seen the look on his face. It was priceless." Linda froze, her expression shifting to one of discomfort. "Jack, don't you think that was too much? What right do you have to burn someone's passport? What if he reports you?" Jack waved her off, his tone indifferent. "He won't dare. People like him always talk big, but they stay quiet when faced with the law." From the dining table, Emily's indignation was impossible to suppress. She closed her laptop and stood, confronting her father. "Dad, do you realize the consequences of what you've done? You didn't just humiliate him. You've disgraced the entire police force. You represent the law." Jack turned to his daughter, his eyes narrowing. "Emily, you don't understand. This is my job. People like him need to be reminded who's in charge." Emily stepped closer, her voice rising. "By burning his passport? Don't you see that's both discriminatory and an abuse of power? This is why people lose faith in the police, because of actions like this." Jack scowled, clearly displeased with his daughter's critique. Sitting up straight, his voice took on a hardened edge. "Don't lecture me, Emily. I've been doing this job since before you were born. I know what I'm doing. Don't let your college lectures fill your head with nonsense." Linda approached, trying to calm the escalating tension. "Jack, I think Emily has a point. You need to be more careful. Times have changed. Things like this can go viral on social media. You never know who might have recorded it." Jack stood, irritation etched on his face. "Both of you are ridiculous. This is my job, and I don't need anyone telling me how to do it. Don't forget, I've kept this family safe for years by upholding the law. He stormed upstairs, leaving Linda and Emily exchanging helpless looks. Linda sighed deeply, wondering if the man she once admired was still the same. Emily reopened her laptop, her thoughts swirling. One question echoed in her mind. Was Jack's behavior today truly doing his job, or was it an unforgivable abuse of power? Upstairs, Jack stood by the window, staring out at the quiet street. Outwardly calm, he couldn't shake the sting of his wife and daughter's words. Yet, he pushed the doubts aside, reassuring himself he had done nothing wrong. What Jack didn't know was that the incident at the airport had been recorded, and it was already starting to spread. What he viewed as a small victory was about to become the greatest nightmare of his life. The next morning, gentle sunlight streamed through the windows of Jack Whitman's car as he drove to the police station. Unlike other days, the streets seemed unusually lively. However, to Jack, the sounds outside were mere background noise to the lingering irritation from the previous night. The argument with his wife and daughter about the airport incident gnawed at him more than he cared to admit. Jack turned on the car radio to fill the void. A news anchor was discussing rising tensions between police and communities, a topic Jack had no interest in. He switched the radio off with a shake of his head. They don't understand what officers like us deal with every day, Jack muttered to himself, his eyes fixed on the road ahead leading to the station. Upon entering the station, Jack immediately sensed the unusual atmosphere. Colleagues gathered in small groups, whispering and glancing toward the main meeting room. They seemed both eager and apprehensive. Jack narrowed his eyes, displeased by the shift in mood. "What's going on?" he asked Officer Sarah Miller, a young officer passing by. "Haven't you heard? We have a new police chief. He's given his first address this morning." Sarah replied, her voice tinged with excitement. Jack smirked, his lips curling into a sardonic half-smile. "Another suit sent down from headquarters to reform us. I bet he has no idea what real work is like." Sarah merely smiled politely and walked on without responding. Jack shook his head and headed to his desk, slumping into his chair with a resigned air. He opened a file but didn't bother reading it, his gaze drifting aimlessly across the room. Other officers were bustling toward the main meeting room. After a few minutes of hesitation, Jack stood and reluctantly followed. The meeting room was packed. Younger officers squeezed into the back rows, while veterans chose seats near the exits in case the speech dragged on too long. Jack entered and took a chair in the back row, crossing his arms with his usual air of indifference. The chatter subsided as the door to the meeting room opened. A tall man in a sleek black suit stepped in, his polished shoes clicking on the floor with a commanding resonance. All eyes turned toward him, and the atmosphere in the room shifted to a heightened seriousness. The man strode to the podium, standing tall and scanning the room with a calm yet confident gaze. He raised a hand, and the room immediately fell silent. "Good morning, everyone," he began, his voice strong and authoritative, but carrying a note of warmth. "I'm David Carter, your new chief of police." For a moment, the room seemed frozen in time. A few officers exchanged surprised glances, but most remained quiet, waiting for him to continue. Meanwhile, in the back row, Jack Whitman sat stunned. For a few seconds, his senses felt paralyzed. His eyes widened as he stared at the man on the podium. The black suit, the tall stature, that voice, David Carter. The image from the previous day flashed vividly in Jack's mind. The flames licking at the passport, David's composed yet icy expression as he said, "You'll regret this." Jack felt his face flush as his heart pounded so loudly he feared those around him could hear it. While Jack struggled to compose himself, David continued his speech. I'm excited to work with all of you. Our job is to protect and serve the community. But to do so effectively, we must ensure that fairness and mutual respect are at the forefront of everything we do." Every word felt like a dagger carving into Jack's conscience. He knew David wouldn't easily forget the airport incident. Yet, David showed no sign of recognition toward Jack, which only heightened Jack's unease. When the speech ended, officers began filing out, some discussing their first impressions of David, while others returned quietly to their work. Jack, however, remained seated, his eyes fixed on David as he left the podium and began conversing with senior staff. Inside Jack, an unsettling feeling grew stronger. He tried to reassure himself that things would blow over, that David might not remember him. But deep down, Jack knew his reign of unchecked authority might soon come to an end. The once solid chair he had occupied for years now felt as though it wobbled beneath him as if a storm were brewing on the horizon. Jack stood abruptly and hurried out of the room, avoiding eye contact with anyone. Meanwhile, David Carter continued his conversations, exuding an air of calm control. At one moment, David's gaze flicked briefly to where Jack had been sitting, and a faint, knowing smile crossed his lips, as if everything was unfolding exactly as planned. All day, Jack Whitman struggled to focus on his work. The image of David Carter at the podium, radiating confidence and authority, haunted him. Jack tried to maintain his usual demeanor around colleagues, but inside, a gnawing anxiety began to take root. Did David remember him? Would the airport incident come to light? A few days after taking office, David Carter began implementing internal reforms. In an all-hands meeting, he emphasized, "We need to build a workplace culture rooted in transparency and respect, not just with the community, but also among colleagues. That's why I want you all to know that any misconduct will be addressed decisively." To bring this vision to life, David introduced a new program, an anonymous reporting system allowing staff to report misconduct without fear of retaliation. Additionally, he organized regular internal audits, encouraging officers to speak openly about unresolved issues within the department. Initially, David's reforms were met with heavy silence. Veteran officers, including Jack, expressed discomfort with these changes, viewing them as unnecessary interference that could undermine the authority they were accustomed to. In private conversations with trusted colleagues, Jack didn't hesitate to voice his disdain. "As if we need more rules. We've been doing things this way for decades, and it's worked just fine," he sneered. Not everyone shared Jack's sentiments. Younger officers, like Sarah Miller, found inspiration in David's leadership. Sarah, a recent recruit, had always felt stifled by the tense atmosphere created by veteran officers like Jack. One morning, during an internal audit meeting, David spoke in a calm but pointed tone. "Does anyone have anything they'd like to share? I'm here to listen, not to judge." Sarah hesitated, glancing around the room. Her colleagues avoided her gaze, especially Jack, who sat in a corner with his arms crossed, his eyes watchful and wary. But Sarah knew this was her chance to speak up, not just for herself, but for others who had remained silent. She stood, her voice trembling slightly but growing steadier as she spoke. "I'd like to share an incident I witnessed." The room fell completely silent. "I saw Officer Whitman abusing his authority during a security check. He intimidated a civilian without valid justification, simply because they didn't meet his arbitrary expectations." Jack's eyes widened, glaring at Sarah in disbelief. But she continued, her voice resolute. "I didn't speak up at the time because I feared retaliation. But if we truly want change, I think we need to start here." The room's tension became almost palpable. Jack let out a derisive laugh, breaking the silence. "What nonsense are you spouting? Do you even know who you're accusing?" David raised a hand, signaling Jack to stop. Turning to Sarah, he said with an encouraging look, "Thank you, Miller. I appreciate your courage in coming forward. That's exactly what we need, transparency. What do you think of Sarah's actions? Were they courageous or reckless? If you were in her position, would you have dared to speak up? Share your thoughts in the comments." Immediately after the meeting, David ordered a comprehensive internal investigation into Jack's conduct. Reports from the anonymous system began to surface, and Jack's name repeatedly appeared. The investigation uncovered not just the incident Sarah had mentioned, but a series of other abuses of power stretching back years. The most damning piece of evidence, a video from the airport capturing Jack burning David's passport, was submitted during the investigation. Holding the USB drive containing the video, David's expression hardened with determination. It was time to bring the truth to light. In the following days, Jack felt the growing pressure within the department. The respectful glances, once directed his way, were now replaced with scrutinizing looks. He tried to maintain his composure, but the wave of investigations and accusations engulfed him like an unstoppable tide. In the smoking area after work, Jack tried rallying the few allies he had left. "This is a witch hunt, nothing more," he said bitterly. "That guy Carter just wants to humiliate me to flex his authority. But I won't go down without a fight." Yet, deep down, Jack knew he was losing his grip. Something fundamental had shifted in the department, and for the first time in his career, Jack felt his position of power teetering precariously. Still, he wasn't ready to give up, at least not yet. The atmosphere at the police station grew increasingly tense. David Carter's internal reviews were starting to yield concrete results. Jack Whitman's name appeared frequently in anonymous reports, and younger officers like Sarah Miller grew bolder in speaking out. However, David's determination also provoked dissatisfaction among veteran officers, those accustomed to the old ways of doing things. Cornered, Jack decided it was time to act. In the smoking area, after hours, he convened a small group of veteran officers who remained loyal to him. The group included Officer Greg Barnes, once Jack's close friend, and Lieutenant Paul Hawkins, a longtime stalwart of the force. Taking a drag from his cigarette, Jack's eyes glinted with cold resolve. "We can't let Carter keep running things like this. He's destroying everything we've built." Greg furrowed his brow. "What do you have in mind? Carter doesn't seem like someone easy to take down." Jack smirked faintly. "We'll show him that no one's perfect. If Carter wants to dig into my past, we can do the same to him." Paul, typically the quiet one, looked up and asked, "What do you mean?" Leaning in, Jack lowered his voice but spoke with calculated intent. "I have a plan. We'll fabricate some evidence showing that Carter abused his power during his previous post. A few questionable reports and some suspicious financial records. With a little finesse, we can force him to defend himself instead of targeting us." Over the next several days, Jack's group began to execute their plan. Paul, experienced in record management, falsified several documents accusing David of accepting illicit payments during his time at a previous police department. Greg used his internal connections to spread rumors about David, sowing seeds of doubt among other officers. Jack, meanwhile, adopted a more cautious approach. He maintained an outwardly cooperative demeanor, waiting for the right moment to push the fabricated evidence up the chain of command. However, Jack underestimated David Carter. One day, David received an anonymous report alleging irregularities in his records. Without hesitation, David ordered an investigation into the origins of these documents. With help from his tech team and a few trusted staff, David quickly uncovered anomalies in the fabricated records created by Jack's group. That afternoon, as Jack sat at his desk, David entered his office holding a folder. The room's atmosphere immediately grew heavy. Colleagues nearby sensed the tension and subtly paused their work, stealing glances at the two men. "Whitman, I need a word with you," David said, his tone calm but sharp. Jack looked up, trying to maintain an air of composure. "What's this about, Chief?" David locked eyes with Jack, placing the folder on his desk. "I've reviewed this evidence, and I know exactly where it came from." Jack stiffened but quickly masked his unease with a thin smile. "I have no idea what you're talking about." Leaning closer, David lowered his voice, each word laced with authority. "Do you think I wouldn't figure it out? You and your team tried to smear me, fabricating these documents. Let me make this clear, Whitman. I'm not easily defeated." Sweat began to bead on Jack's back, but he refused to back down. "I don't know what you're insinuating, Chief. If you have evidence, feel free to present it." David straightened, his gaze never leaving Jack. "The evidence will be presented, but mark my words, you will be held accountable for every action." The following day, David convened an emergency meeting with senior officers. During the meeting, he publicly laid out the evidence exposing Jack and his accomplices' plot. The forged documents, tampered records, and false rumors were meticulously debunked in front of the entire department. Sitting in the front row, Jack's face was dark and rigid. He could feel the disdainful stares from his colleagues. Those who had once silently supported him now distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with the fallout. "We cannot tolerate behavior like this," David declared, his voice firm and resolute. "The integrity of this department is not something to be undermined by selfish schemes or petty conspiracies." Jack felt as though the ground beneath his chair was collapsing. He knew the game was over, yet a flicker of resentment burned within him. This wasn't the end, not for him at least. When David Carter thought he had brought the internal chaos under control after Jack Whitman's conspiracy, another storm erupted, this time from outside. Early one Monday morning, as David reviewed reports on recent reforms, his phone buzzed incessantly. News of a viral video had reached him. The video, filmed at the airport, captured the moment Jack burned David's passport. The scene of Jack coldly lighting the document on fire, his sneering words, "Go ahead, try to sue," were clear as day. The video spread rapidly, drawing thousands of outraged comments condemning Jack's actions and demanding accountability. David set his phone down, his brow furrowed. He realized this was no longer just an internal issue. It had become a public crisis, and he now faced immense pressure from the community. Within 24 hours, activist groups organized protests outside the police station. Protesters carried signs reading, "Justice for all," "No to discrimination," and "Fire Jack Whitman now." Their chants formed an unrelenting wave of pressure pounding against the station's glass walls. Inside, the atmosphere was taut as a drawn bowstring. Many officers, unaccustomed to such public scrutiny, grew uneasy. Some avoided looking out the windows where the crowd continued to swell. Jack, on the other hand, tried to appear nonchalant, though the tension in his eyes betrayed him. "These are just rabble-rousers," Jack scoffed during an internal meeting. "We don't need to pay them any attention." David, standing at the head of the table, remained composed. He didn't respond immediately but fixed his gaze on Jack, his expression stern. "Rabble-rousers? or citizens demanding transparency and fairness from the very institution meant to protect them, David's voice was cold but firm. You should remember, Whitman, that it's your actions that led to this. Jack clenched his fists but said nothing more. That afternoon, tensions escalated. A group of protesters moved closer to the security barriers, demanding to speak with David directly. Some officers tried to hold them back, but the scene quickly grew chaotic. An older protester was pushed to the ground, prompting shouts and anger. A few younger protesters began to push back, forcing officers to call for reinforcements to maintain order. From his office, David heard the commotion and stepped outside. As he approached the entrance, the chaotic scene came into view. A furious crowd, a tense line of officers, and a few protesters attempting to breach the barriers. "Stop this immediately," David shouted, his voice cutting through the noise and drawing everyone's attention. He walked into the middle of the fray, showing no fear in the face of the crowd. Raising his hand, David signaled the officers to stand down. "No one is to use force. This is not how we resolve issues," he said, his stern gaze sweeping across the security detail. Then, turning to the crowd, his tone softened but remained authoritative. "I understand your anger. I understand your demand for justice. I want that too. But if we let emotions take over, we achieve nothing. Let me speak with you." The murmurs among the crowd gradually subsided. A middle-aged woman, likely the group's leader, stepped forward. "Chief Carter, we want to know what you're going to do to ensure that actions like Jack Whitman's never happen again." David nodded, his gaze steady. "I promise there will be a thorough and public investigation. Any misconduct, regardless of who is responsible, will be addressed decisively. Furthermore, I will continue to implement reforms to build a more transparent police force. But I need your cooperation. Express your concerns peacefully." A brief silence hung in the air. Then a few people in the crowd nodded. The woman lowered her voice. "We'll wait to see your actions, but remember, we won't wait forever." David felt the weight of her words, but stood firm. "I understand, and I assure you, you'll see change." That evening, after the crowd had dispersed, David sat in his office, gazing out the window. He knew this was just the beginning. Public trust had been shaken, and words alone wouldn't be enough to restore it. But he also knew that with every step, no matter how challenging, he was moving closer to his goal: building a police force that truly served justice and fairness. Meanwhile, Jack sat alone in the smoking area, his eyes bloodshot. He knew his position was no longer just unstable, it was on the verge of collapse. Yet, a lingering sense of bitterness smoldered within him. He couldn't accept that his decades-long career might end this way. And though he didn't say it aloud, deep down, Jack knew he hadn't given up on seeking revenge. Following the protests outside the police station, the pressure on Jack Whitman continued to mount. Public criticism extended beyond the demonstrations, spreading rapidly across social media platforms. The community demanded a transparent and public investigation, leaving David Carter with no choice but to expedite the handling of the case. David understood that to regain the community's trust and maintain discipline within the police department, he needed undeniable evidence. And he had it. 3 days after the protests, David convened a full departmental meeting. The meeting room was packed, the atmosphere thick with tension. Officers filed in, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and unease. Jack sat in a corner, arms crossed, attempting to feign indifference but unable to hide the strain on his face. David entered the room, carrying a laptop and a file. He stood tall at the front of the room, his gaze sweeping across the crowd before he began speaking. his voice calm yet authoritative. "We have faced significant challenges over the past week, and today I'm here to share the results of our investigation." David opened the laptop and connected it to the room's large screen. Within seconds, footage from the airport security cameras appeared on the screen. The video clearly showed Jack standing at the checkpoint, lighting David's passport on fire. The room fell silent. The tension was so palpable that the sound of a pin dropping would have been audible. Officers stared at the screen, some with their mouths agape, others shaking their heads quietly. Turning back to the room, David's voice took on a steely edge. This is what occurred at the airport. This video, along with witness statements and additional evidence, confirms that Officer Jack Whitman severely violated protocol and professional ethics. His actions not only tarnished the reputation of our police force, but also breached international standards of fairness and justice. Jack froze in his seat, his face flushing red. "This is a smear campaign," he shouted, trying to cling to any remaining authority. "You can't convict me based on one video." David remained unflustered, his sharp gaze fixed on Jack. "I'm not relying on just this video, Whitman. I have dozens of reports from your colleagues. If you want to challenge this further, I'm prepared to present everything to the disciplinary board." The meeting concluded, but the tension within the station lingered. After the evidence was revealed, colleagues who had previously stayed silent about Jack's behavior began to speak out. Officer Sarah Miller, who had initially exposed Jack, added more accounts of his misconduct. Several other officers, hesitant at first, soon joined her. "He threatened me when I tried to report one of his violations," said Officer Brian Hughes during an internal meeting. "I stayed quiet out of fear for my job, but now I think it's time to come forward." "It's not just the airport," added veteran Lieutenant Karen Lopez. "Jack has used his authority to intimidate vulnerable individuals for years. It's been happening for far too long, and no one dared to intervene." Each new revelation added to the mounting pressure on Jack. Former allies distanced themselves, unwilling to be dragged into the storm surrounding him. Jack, now like a cornered animal, scrambled to defend himself. He approached former colleagues in private, attempting to dissuade them from participating in the investigation. "We've worked together for years. You're not going to abandon me, are you?" he pleaded, his tone a mix of desperation and defiance. But the usual response was silence or avoiding eye contact. That evening, Jack sat alone in his living room, staring blankly into space. He knew he was losing everything: the respect of his peers, his position at the station, and possibly his entire career. Yet, rather than acknowledge his mistakes, he clung to the belief that this was a witch hunt targeting him. Meanwhile, David Carter continued to push the investigation forward with transparency and diligence. He understood that to restore the community's trust, he needed not only to handle Jack's case fairly, but also to ensure his reforms laid a solid foundation for the future. However, David also knew that Jack wasn't entirely defeated, and he prepared himself for whatever might come next. After the evidence against Jack Whitman was revealed, David Carter refrained from celebrating any victories. He knew that removing one wrongdoer was only the first step. True change required rebuilding trust, not just within the police department, but also with the community watching his every move. In those tense days, as he sat alone in his office after hours, memories of his past resurfaced. Painful, yet motivating recollections that had shaped him into the leader he is today. As a young man, David Carter wasn't the strong and confident figure he had become. The son of immigrant parents, he grew up in a poor neighborhood where violence and discrimination were part of daily life. His parents worked tirelessly to make ends meet, while David, a bright and ambitious black teenager, constantly fought for fair treatment. One memory stood out vividly in David's mind: the day he was stopped by local police on his way home from school. At just 16 years old, wearing a worn hoodie and carrying a backpack full of books, he was approached by two officers who demanded to search his bag without offering any explanation. One officer rummaged through his belongings roughly, while the other watched him with suspicion. "Kid, what did you steal in here?" one of them sneered. David tried to remain calm. "It's just my books. I'm coming home from school." But his words fell on deaf ears. The officer continued rifling through his bag, tossing his books onto the ground with no regard. The humiliation weighed heavily on young David's shoulders. At that moment, he made a promise to himself. One day, he would work in law enforcement, not to become one of them, but to change the system so that no child would ever have to endure such indignity. Now, sitting in his office, gazing out at the golden light of the setting sun, those memories were more than just a source of pain. They were a reminder of his mission. He wasn't just here to deal with Jack Whitman. He was here to build something better. David began by reaching out to the younger officers in the department, especially those who had experienced oppression or injustice. He took time to speak with Officer Sarah Miller, who had bravely exposed Jack, and others like Brian Hughes, who had been intimidated by Jack. He listened to their stories and assured them they would be protected from retaliation. "You spoke up for justice," David said during a small meeting with young officers, "and I'll do everything in my power to ensure your voices are not ignored." Beyond the department, David turned his attention to the victims of police misconduct in the community. He organized a town hall meeting with community members who had been affected by abusive practices. During the meeting, heart-wrenching stories emerged. A father mistreated while protecting his child, a woman denied assistance due to prejudice, and young people like David himself, feeling voiceless and powerless. David didn't just listen, he acted. He reopened several old cases that had been ignored or dismissed, committing to review each complaint with fairness. He also proposed reforms to ensure victims could report misconduct without fear of retaliation. "I can't promise that everything will change overnight," David said during the town hall, "but I promise to work tirelessly to make a difference." David's efforts didn't always receive unanimous support. Some veteran officers quietly opposed him, accusing him of dismantling traditions and harming the department's reputation. But David wasn't deterred. He knew that dismantling a deeply entrenched system of injustice required persistence and courage. As he left the station one evening, David saw a group of children playing basketball on a nearby street. He paused for a moment, recalling the 16-year-old boy in the hoodie from years ago. "I'm doing this for them," he thought, before turning to head home. David wasn't just a police chief. He was a leader with a profound mission: to build a system where justice wasn't just an idea, but a reality for everyone. And in the eyes of the young people in the community, he saw hope. A hope that, despite the long road ahead, they were heading in the right direction. David Carter's reform efforts were beginning to bring noticeable changes to the police department. However, for Jack Whitman, it was the beginning of the end. The internal investigations not only exposed his abuse of power at the airport, but also unearthed numerous past violations. Day by day, everything Jack had once taken pride in, his authority, respect, and position, was crumbling before his eyes. On a Monday morning, the officers were summoned to the main assembly hall for a departmental meeting. The exact agenda was unclear, but the air was thick with tension. Jack entered the room, avoiding the eyes of his former colleagues. He took a seat in the back row, trying to maintain his composure, though his palms were clammy with sweat. David stepped up to the podium, standing tall as his gaze swept across the room. He allowed a moment of silence to linger, enough for everyone to feel the gravity of the situation. Finally, he began, his voice steady but piercing. We have conducted an extensive internal investigation over the past weeks. These findings not only highlight individual misconduct, but also underscore our collective responsibility to uphold ethical standards and maintain the trust of the community we serve. David paused and opened a file on the desk in front of him. After a thorough review, this department has decided Officer Jack Whitman will be stripped of his badge effective immediately and will face legal charges for severe misconduct and ethical violations. The room was silent, as if it had collectively held its breath. Some officers turned to look at Jack, their expressions a mixture of shock and relief. Others couldn't hide their disdain. Jack sat frozen, his face pale. He opened his mouth to say something, but no words came out. Whitman, David continued, his tone firm. Your actions have not only disgraced this department, but have also harmed the very people we swore to protect. Today, you will face the consequences of your choices. David nodded toward two officers who stepped forward. Jack rose from his seat, his face a mask of stunned disbelief. One officer removed the badge from Jack's uniform, the emblem of authority he had wielded for over 2 decades. At that moment, Jack felt as though the ground beneath him had given way. At home, Jack sat numbly on his couch, his hands trembling. For days, he had told himself everything would eventually blow over, that he could weather the storm. But now, the reality was undeniable. He had lost his job, his dignity, and the position he once held with pride. When Linda, his wife, entered the room, Jack looked at her with pleading eyes. Linda, you don't understand. This is all a setup. Carter and those young officers just want to ruin me. Linda crossed her arms, her expression weary and filled with disappointment. Jack, do you think I haven't seen it? The whole community has seen it. You abused your power. You crossed the line, and I can't stand by and watch this anymore. What are you saying? Jack asked, his voice filled with desperation. We're a family. You can't leave me. Linda shook her head, her voice trembling. This isn't the first time, Jack. But this time, it's gone too far. I can't teach Emily that she should forgive this kind of behavior. And I can't forgive you either. At that moment, Emily walked in, overhearing her mother's words. She looked at Jack, the admiration he had once seen in her eyes now replaced with disillusionment. Dad, you always thought you were protecting justice, but you don't see that you're the reason people have lost faith in the police. Jack started to argue, but fell silent. He had nothing left to say, nothing to defend. Linda and Emily packed their belongings, and before leaving, Linda turned back one last time, her eyes filled with regret. We were a family, Jack, but you destroyed that. The house felt eerily quiet after Linda and Emily left. Jack sat alone in the living room, staring blankly out the window. The table in front of him was cluttered with legal documents, disciplinary summons, and notices of the charges he now faced. Jack had once believed himself untouchable, capable of overcoming any challenge through his authority and position. But now, he realized everything he had built, his career, his family, his self-respect, had disintegrated. Jack was no longer the respected officer he had been. He was just a lonely man, undone by his actions. Yet, in that silence, a faint glimmer of something stirred within Jack. Perhaps, just perhaps, This was an opportunity to face himself and start over. But would he have the courage to do so? Or would he remain consumed by resentment and regret? The answer was far from clear. Jack Whitman's departure marked a significant turning point within the police department. For David Carter, it wasn't just the removal of one individual's wrongdoing, it was the beginning of a new chapter. However, David understood that eliminating one person wasn't enough to address the deeply rooted issues within the system. He needed to transform the entire way the department operated, not just to regain the trust of the community, but also to build a force that was truly fair and transparent. In the weeks that followed, David began implementing a comprehensive reform plan. On the first morning after Jack's dismissal, he convened a meeting with the department's leadership team. Laid out before him was a detailed list of changes he had been preparing for months. David started with a strong statement. We cannot build trust with the community if we are not trustworthy. Starting today, we will not only correct the mistakes of the past, but also lay the foundation for a future everyone can take pride in. He announced a mandatory training program for all staff, from recruits to senior leaders. This program focused on identifying and eliminating biases while emphasizing the importance of fairness in their duties. David didn't shy away from acknowledging the reality that many in the department, whether knowingly or unknowingly, had allowed prejudice to influence their actions. We need to confront this reality, David said during a meeting, not to assign blame, but to drive change. Additionally, David established an anonymous reporting system, allowing employees to report misconduct without fear of retaliation. This system was managed by an independent external team to ensure transparency and integrity. Every report was taken seriously, and David vowed that no case would be ignored. Initially, these changes were met with resistance from some veteran officers who felt threatened by the shift. We've been doing things this way for decades, one officer said in a meeting. Why change now? David remained resolute, responding with calm determination. Decades don't mean right, and if we don't change now, we risk losing everything: trust, respect, and the ability to carry out our mission. At the same time, David expanded collaboration with the community. He invited community leaders, human rights activists, and representatives from non-governmental organizations to participate in public forums. These meetings were not just spaces for dialogue, but opportunities to build bridges and foster understanding. During one such forum, Linda Parker, a renowned human rights activist, spoke. Our community has endured too much harm from abuses of power. But today, I stand here to say that if the police department is genuinely committed to change, we are willing to work with you to rebuild trust. David listened to every word, every question, and every criticism. He didn't shy away from difficult or contentious topics. After each forum, he and his team documented the feedback and developed actionable solutions, from increasing oversight of police activities to launching community education programs. One of David's most significant initiatives was organizing regular meetings between police officers and the community. In these gatherings, officers weren't there to give orders, but to listen and explain. The candid conversations helped dispel many misunderstandings and laid the groundwork for a relationship built on mutual respect. David's reforms didn't just impact the department's operations, but also resonated throughout the community. Young officers like Sarah Miller and Brian Hughes felt reinvigorated. They began to take pride in their work, seeing it not just as enforcing the law, but as a mission to bring fairness to everyone. Yet, David knew the journey was far from over. He understood that change wouldn't come overnight or even in a few months. Still, he felt hope every time he stepped outside the department and saw community members smiling and greeting him. A small but meaningful sign that trust was beginning to return. For David, these reforms were more than just professional duties. They were a promise he had made to himself as a teenager standing before officers who had abused their power. And now, he knew he was on the right path, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever endured injustice. The sweeping changes within the police department under David Carter's leadership quickly became the focus of the community's attention. While reforms continued to be implemented, the echoes of the incident involving Jack Whitman had not yet faded. The public, though appreciative of David's efforts, had not forgotten the man who once epitomized abuse of power and injustice. For Jack, the community's indignation was a relentless and harsh sentence that extended far beyond any official punishment. Jack sat in the empty house that had once been his family's home. Linda and Emily had left weeks earlier, taking with them the laughter, stories, and warmth that had once filled the space. Now, all that remained was silence and cold, barren walls. Jack held a picture frame in his hands, a photo of his family on a picnic many years ago. In the photo, he was smiling brightly. Linda had her arm around him, and Emily stood between them, her innocent grin shining like a beacon. But now, that smile existed only in memories. Jack placed the photo down on the table, his gaze heavy with regret. Over the past few days, he had tried to justify his actions to himself, that he had only done things the way they had always been done, that he wasn't the first to abuse power and certainly wouldn't be the last. But the more he thought about it, the hollower those excuses felt. He switched on his old TV, and immediately his image appeared on the screen. The infamous footage of him burning his passport at the airport. Protesters waved signs demanding justice, and a short news segment detailed the legal charges he was facing. Jack turned off the TV, but the images had already burned into his mind. For the first time in years, Jack began to question himself. He could no longer deny it. His actions were not only wrong, but had left deep scars on those he had once disregarded. It wasn't just the victim at the airport. It was also the younger colleagues like Sarah Miller, who had endured his bullying. It was the community he had sworn to protect but had ultimately betrayed. One morning, Jack decided to do something he never thought he would. He dressed neatly, left the house, and walked toward the police department. The gazes of the townspeople were cold, some even contemptuous. Jack felt their judgment, and he didn't blame them. He knew he had become a symbol of everything they despised. Entering the police department, Jack felt as if he were stepping back into a place that was both familiar and alien. His former colleagues, once hesitant to confront him, now avoided his eyes. Jack didn't blame them. He knew any respect they had for him was long gone. He stopped in front of David Carter's office door, took a deep breath, and knocked. "Come in," David's voice called from inside. As Jack stepped in, David looked up, his expression briefly showing surprise before returning to calm neutrality. He sat upright, waiting for an explanation from the man standing before him. "Chief Carter," Jack began, his voice lower and shakier than he had intended. "I don't know where to start, but I'm here to apologize." David didn't respond, simply listening in silence. "I was wrong," Jack continued, his gaze dropping. "Not just at the airport, but for years. I abused my power, neglected my responsibilities, and hurt so many people. I can't change what happened, but I want to make things right." David studied Jack for a long moment before replying, his tone no longer harsh but firm and measured. Recognizing your mistakes is the first step, Whitman. But to truly change, you need to act. Words alone won't repair the damage you've done." Jack nodded, his eyes red and teary. "I understand. I don't expect forgiveness right away, but I want to do something, anything, to make amends." David didn't reply immediately. After a moment of thought, he said, "Start by learning to listen. I can help you find ways to contribute positively to the community, but the rest is up to you." After the meeting, Jack left the police department feeling a weight lifted for the first time in months. Though the road ahead was long and filled with challenges, he knew he had taken the first step toward redemption. Deep down, Jack hoped that one day he could look back and see that he had done the right thing. But first, he had to face the consequences of his past and prove he was capable of real change. Jack Whitman left the police department after meeting with David Carter, carrying a mix of relief and anxiety. He knew that acknowledging his mistakes was only the first step, and that the path ahead would be anything but easy. However, for the first time in months, Jack felt like he was moving in the right direction. Not to reclaim his lost reputation, but to do the right thing. Meanwhile, under David's leadership, the police department not only addressed the fallout from Jack's case, but also became a symbol of reform and renewal. Programs such as anti-bias training and anonymous reporting systems began yielding tangible results. Younger officers like Sarah Miller and Brian Hughes no longer hesitated to speak up, while veteran officers, initially resistant, gradually started to embrace and adapt to the changes. David didn't stop at internal reforms. He continued to build bridges with the community through regular dialogue programs. One standout initiative was the formation of collaborative groups between police officers and residents where citizens could directly participate in solving neighborhood issues. The relationship between the police and the community, once fractured, was slowly mending through concrete actions and mutual commitment. As for Jack, he began his journey toward redemption by participating in rehabilitation programs introduced by David. Workshops on professional ethics and the impact of abuse of power helped Jack confront his past mistakes while giving him a new perspective on responsibility and fairness. What truly transformed Jack, however, was his involvement in community support organizations that aided underprivileged groups, those he had ignored or even harmed during his career. During a food distribution event in a low-income area, Jack encountered an elderly man who immediately recognized him. "You're Jack Whitman, aren't you?" the man asked, his tone tinged with skepticism. Jack nodded, bracing for criticism. Instead, the man offered a faint, sorrowful smile. "I don't know why you're here, but if you want to help, you'd better mean it." Those words became Jack's guiding principle. He realized that apologies weren't enough. Only action could prove his sincerity. Day by day, Jack worked tirelessly, not seeking forgiveness but hoping to make even a small positive impact. A year later, David Carter stood on a stage at a major conference attended by leaders from across the country, sharing the story of transformation within his police department. In his speech, David detailed the challenges he and his team had overcome, from addressing internal misconduct to rebuilding trust with the community. "When I began this journey," David said, his voice steady yet powerful, "I didn't expect immediate change. I only knew that if we wanted a fairer system, we had to start with ourselves. Justice and respect are not optional. They are obligations. We owe it to those we serve and to the values we stand for." The room erupted in applause. In the back row, Jack Whitman sat quietly, observing. He knew he would never regain his former position or reputation, but he also understood that it no longer mattered. What mattered was his effort to become a better person, a contributor rather than a destroyer. David noticed Jack in the audience. The two exchanged a brief nod, not one of complete forgiveness, but of acknowledgement. It was a sign that, while their paths were different, both were now on the right track. The police department, now a symbol of reform, continued to lead new initiatives and served as a model for other departments across the nation. In the community, people began to feel that while the journey to justice was far from over, they had taken the first firm steps. As David stepped out of the conference hall into the cool evening air, he felt a refreshing breeze. He knew the road ahead would be long, but the work he and others had done proved one thing: change is possible if one dares to begin. The story of transformation within the police department is not just the journey of David Carter or Jack Whitman. It is a reminder that we always have the opportunity to correct our mistakes and build a fairer future. What are your thoughts on Jack's journey and the reforms implemented by David? Do you believe that an individual, even after committing significant mistakes, can change and make a difference? Share your opinions in the comments below. We would love to hear your thoughts. Don't forget to like, share this story with your friends, and subscribe to our channel to discover more inspiring stories about change and hope. Thank you for watching, and we look forward to seeing you in the next video.